They thought he was just a statue in red. 4 masked men breached the ropes at Buckingham Palace, charging straight at the royal guard. One yanked at his rifle, another clawed at his face, a third lunged low, aiming to knock him off balance. They believed he wouldn't fight back, but in less than 30 seconds, armed response flooded the courtyard. 2 attackers were face down on the ground, the other 2 handcuffed and stunned, and the royal guard, still on his feet, still silent, still watching. What happened next shocked the crowd, and it was all caught on camera. Before we break it down, moment by moment, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Let's get into it. The morning of October 15th started like any other at Buckingham Palace. The autumn mist clung to the ornate iron gates as tourists gathered with their cameras, hoping to catch a glimpse of the changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood Guardsman James Fletcher, a 28-year-old veteran of 2 tours in Afghanistan, his scarlet tunic immaculate, his bearskin hat perfectly positioned. To the casual observer, he was merely a living statue, a quaint British tradition frozen in time. Fletcher had been standing at his post for exactly 47 minutes. When the black transit van screeched around the corner of Constitution Hill, the tourists barely glanced at it. Initially, London traffic was notorious, after all, but something about the van's erratic movement caught Fletcher's attention. His peripheral vision, honed by years of scanning Afghan horizons for threats, registered the vehicle's aggressive approach even as his body remained perfectly still. The van's tires squealed as it mounted the curb, sending pedestrians scattering like startled pigeons. 4 men poured out before the vehicle had fully stopped, their faces obscured by black balaclavas, crowbars, and metal pipes gleaming in their hands. The tourists' excited chatter died instantly, replaced by screams and the thunder of running feet as people fled in every direction. Mark Mac Harrison, the group's self-appointed leader, had spent weeks planning this moment. A career criminal with a rap sheet longer than his attention span, Mac had convinced his crew that attacking a royal guard would send a message to the establishment. What he hadn't counted on was that this particular guard had survived 3 explosions and had once held off a Taliban assault for 40 minutes while waiting for extraction. Fletcher's training kicked in with mechanical precision. His eyes swept the approaching threats, calculating distances, assessing weapons, identifying the primary aggressor. Mac charged first, raising his crowbar in a wild overhead swing aimed at the guard's skull. In that split second, Fletcher made a decision that would define the next 30 seconds of absolute chaos. The ceremonial rifle, typically used for drill movements and parade formations, became a weapon of precise lethality. In Fletcher's hands, the steel barrel intercepted Mac's crowbar with a metallic clang that echoed across the courtyard. The impact sent vibrations up Mac's arms, causing him to stumble backward, his confidence evaporating as quickly as the morning mist. Fletcher's counterattack was swift and brutal. The rifle but connected with Mac's jaw with surgical precision, the crack of breaking bone audible even over the screams of fleeing tourists. Mac collapsed to the cobblestones, blood streaming from his mouth, his crowbar clattering uselessly beside him. The second rioter, Danny Razor Murphy, rushed in from Fletcher's left flank, swinging a length of steel pipe in a horizontal arc. Fletcher ducked under the swing with fluid grace, his movements economical and deadly. As Murphy's momentum carried him forward, Fletcher drove his knee into the man's solar plexus, folding him in half before delivering a devastating uppercut that lifted Murphy off his feet and sent him crashing into the ornate palace gates. The third attacker, Tommy Walsh, had been hanging back, waiting for an opening. He pulled a knife from his jacket, its blade catching the pale October sunlight. This was the moment Fletcher's combat experience truly showed. In Afghanistan, knife-wielding insurgents were a constant threat, and Fletcher had learned to neutralize them with ruthless efficiency. As Walsh lunged forward with the blade, Fletcher sidestepped and caught the man's wrist in a joint lock that would have made his army instructors proud. The technique, perfected through countless hours of close-quarters combat training, applied pressure to Walsh's radius and ulnar bones simultaneously. The snap was audible, and Walsh's scream pierced the air as his knife fell harmlessly to the ground. The fourth rioter, Sean Collins, had been recording the attack on his phone, believing he was documenting their moment of glory. Instead, he found himself witnessing the systematic dismantling of his crew by a single soldier who hadn't moved more than 6 feet from his original position. Collins dropped his phone and reached for a hammer tucked into his belt. but his hands were shaking so violently he could barely grip the tool. Fletcher assessed the final threat with the same cold calculation he'd shown the others. Collins was clearly the weakest link, his amateur movements telegraphing his intentions from yards away. When Collins finally worked up the courage to charge, Fletcher was ready. The guard's response was textbook military efficiency. He grabbed Collins by the collar and used the man's own momentum to redirect him face first into the stone base of a nearby lamppost. Collins crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he hit the pavement, joining his 3 associates in various states of defeat around Fletcher's post. Through it all, Fletcher's ceremonial duties never wavered. His feet remained planted in the exact position prescribed by centuries of tradition. His bearskin hat stayed perfectly aligned. To anyone arriving after the fact, it would appear as though he had never moved at all. Save for the 4 groaning criminals scattered around him like broken toys, the entire engagement had lasted exactly 28 seconds. Meanwhile, inside the palace's security control room, Sergeant Major William Thompson was already coordinating the response. The moment the van had appeared on the perimeter cameras, Thompson had initiated Code Black, the highest level of security alert. His fingers flew across the radio controls as he dispatched armed response units from 3 different locations around the palace grounds. The first team was already sprinting across the courtyard, their black tactical gear a stark contrast to Fletcher's ceremonial uniform. These weren't the tourist-friendly police officers usually seen around the palace. These were specialist firearms officers from CO-19, London's elite tactical unit, men and women trained to respond to terrorist attacks and high-threat situations. Inspector Sarah Chen led the first response team around the corner at full sprint, her Heckler & Koch MP5 held in a low ready position. She had been briefing her team on a completely unrelated security matter when the alarm sounded, but her years of experience had taught her to expect the unexpected. What she didn't expect was to find 4 suspects already neutralized by a single royal guard, who was still standing perfectly at attention. Armed police. Nobody move. Chen's voice cut through the air with absolute authority as her team fanned out in a textbook tactical formation. The tourists who had taken shelter behind cars and lampposts remained frozen, some still recording on their phones, despite the obvious danger. Collins was the first to regain consciousness, groaning as he struggled to focus his eyes. The first thing he saw was the business end of Chen's MP5 pointed directly at his forehead. Any thoughts of continued resistance evaporated instantly as the full weight of his situation became clear. "Stay down. Hands where I can see them." Officer Marcus Wright barked at Mac, who was attempting to crawl away despite his broken jaw. Wright's voice carried the kind of authority that made hardened criminals comply without question. The medical team arrived 60 seconds later, followed by Detective Chief Inspector Robert Hayes from the Counter-Terrorism Command. Hayes took one look at the scene and immediately began coordinating what would become one of the most thorough investigations in recent palace security history. Fletcher, throughout the entire response, maintained his position with unwavering discipline. When Chen approached him to take his initial statement, she found herself speaking to a man who seemed entirely unaffected by the violence that had just erupted around him. "Guardsman Fletcher," Chen said, her tone respectful but professional, "I need to ask you about what happened here." Fletcher's response was delivered in the clipped, precise manner of a career soldier. "4 suspects approached my position with weapons. They initiated physical contact. I responded with appropriate force to neutralize the threat while maintaining my post." The investigation that followed would reveal the depth of planning behind what initially appeared to be a random attack. Detective Inspector Hayes discovered that Mac Harrison had been conducting surveillance of the palace for weeks, taking photographs and timing the guard rotations. His plan, such as it was, involved creating a viral video that would embarrass the royal family and, in his twisted logic, somehow strike a blow against the British establishment. Harrison's criminal history painted a picture of a man perpetually angry at the world around him. Born in Manchester to a family that struggled with poverty and addiction, Mac had spent more years in prison than out since turning 18. His latest conviction had been for assault during a football riot, where he had attacked a police horse with a traffic cone. The 3 men he had recruited for this venture were equally troubled individuals. Danny Murphy had been Mac's cellmate during a 6-month stretch in Strangeways prison. Murphy's specialty was burglary, though his success rate was so poor that he'd been caught more often than not. Tommy Walsh had a history of knife crimes that stretched back to his teenage years, while Sean Collins was the newest addition to their crew, recruited more for his van than his criminal expertise. What none of them had researched was the background of the guards they planned to attack. Had they done so, they might have discovered that Guardsman Fletcher had earned a military cross for his actions during a Taliban attack on his forward operating base in Helmand province. They certainly wouldn't have learned that he held a black belt in Krav Maga and had served as a hand-to-hand combat instructor before joining the Household Division. Fletcher's military record was exemplary. He had joined the army at 18, driven by a desire to serve his country and escape the limited opportunities in his hometown of Blackpool. His first deployment to Afghanistan came when he was barely 21, and it was there that he discovered his natural talent for soldiering. The incident that earned him his military cross occurred during his second tour. Fletcher's patrol base came under sustained attack from a force of Taliban fighters estimated at more than 40 men, when an IED destroyed their communications equipment and wounded 3 of his comrades. Fletcher took command of the remaining 8 soldiers and organized a defense that held out for over an hour until reinforcements arrived. The Palace medical team, led by Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, worked efficiently to treat the 4 attackers. Morrison, a veteran of field hospitals in both Iraq and Afghanistan, had seen worse injuries, but she was struck by the precision of the damage Fletcher had inflicted. Each injury was severe enough to immediately neutralize the threat, but calculated to avoid permanent disability or death. Mac's broken jaw would require surgical repair, but the fracture was clean and would heal completely. With proper treatment, Murphy's solar plexus injury had left him gasping for breath but caused no lasting damage to his internal organs. Walsh's broken wrist was a textbook defensive injury, the kind taught in military close-quarters combat courses as a non-disarming technique. Collins's concussion was mild, though his pride was thoroughly shattered. Whoever taught this soldier knows what they're doing, Morrison commented to Hayes as she supervised the loading of the suspects into ambulances. These injuries are precisely what you'd expect from someone trained to neutralize threats with minimal force. Hayes nodded, making notes in his ever-present notebook. The investigation was revealing layers of complexity that went far beyond a simple assault. The attackers' planning, the guards' response, and the rapid arrival of armed support all suggested that Palace security was far more sophisticated than most people realized. The tourists who had witnessed the attack were providing statements that painted a picture of absolute chaos, transformed into perfect order in less than 30 seconds. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, a retired teacher from Yorkshire, described Fletcher's actions as like watching a dancer, but violent. Her husband Harold added that the guard never seemed to lose his temper, even when that horrible man was swinging that metal bar at his head. Young Sophie Martinez, a Spanish exchange student studying in London, had captured part of the incident. On her phone, her footage showed the precise moment when Fletcher intercepted Mac's crowbar, the steel-on-steel impact clearly audible on the recording. The video, which would later be viewed millions of times on social media, also captured Fletcher's immediate return to his ceremonial stance once the threat was neutralized. The aftermath of the incident stretched far beyond the palace gates. Within hours, news organizations from around the world were reporting on the attack and its dramatic conclusion. The palace press office, led by Communications Secretary Amanda Hartwell, found themselves managing a story that had international implications. Hartwell, a former BBC journalist who had covered conflicts in Bosnia and Sierra Leone, understood the delicate balance required in handling such a sensitive story. On one hand, the incident demonstrated the effectiveness of palace security. On the other hand, it revealed vulnerabilities that could be exploited by more sophisticated attackers. The professionalism shown by all members of our security team today reflects the highest standards of the British Armed Forces. Hartwell's official statement read, "We are grateful that no members of the public were injured during this incident." Behind the scenes, however, a comprehensive security review was already underway. Colonel James Ashworth, commanding officer of the Household Division, was coordinating with Metropolitan Police Commissioner Patricia Wells to analyze every aspect of the attack and response. Ashworth had served alongside Fletcher in Afghanistan and was unsurprised by his subordinate's performance. "Fletcher is exactly the kind of soldier we want representing the Crown," he told Wells during their emergency briefing. "Professional, disciplined, and absolutely lethal when the situation requires it. The security review would eventually recommend several changes to palace protocols, including enhanced vehicle barriers and additional plainclothes officers in the tourist areas. However, the fundamental approach to royal protection, highly trained soldiers in ceremonial roles backed by sophisticated surveillance and rapid response capabilities, was validated by the day's events. Fletcher himself remained characteristically modest about his actions. When debriefed by his commanding officer, he simply stated that he had followed his training and protected his post. This understated response was typical of the man who had once walked 2 miles through Taliban territory to call in artillery support for his surrounded unit. The legal proceedings that followed would become a textbook case in the application of reasonable force by military personnel in civilian settings. The Crown Prosecution Service, led by Director of Public Prosecutions Margaret Thornton QC, had to balance several competing interests: the clear criminal intent of the attackers, the proportionate response by Fletcher, and the public interest in maintaining palace security. Mac Harrison and his crew were charged with multiple offenses, including conspiracy to commit assault, possession of offensive weapons, and criminal damage. Their defense attorney, Michael Brennan, QC, attempted to argue that his clients had been victims of excessive force, but this line of argument collapsed when the full extent of their planning was revealed. The investigation uncovered detailed surveillance notes, photographs of guard positions, and even a crude map of escape routes. Most damaging was a voice recording on Collins's phone where Mac could be heard saying, "We're going to show these toy soldiers what real violence looks like." Fletcher was cleared of any wrongdoing within 48 hours of the incident. The Independent Office for Police Conduct, which had automatically launched an investigation due to the injuries sustained by the attackers, concluded that his actions were reasonable, proportionate, and entirely justified given the circumstances. The international reaction to the incident was overwhelmingly positive. Military experts from the United States, France, and Germany praised Fletcher's restraint and professionalism. Colonel retired James Mitchell, a U.S. Army Special Forces veteran, wrote in the Washington Post that Fletcher's actions represented the gold standard for rules of engagement in civilian environments. Social media reaction was equally supportive, with the hashtag #RoyalGuardHero trending worldwide within hours of the incident. Videos of Fletcher's precise defensive movements were analyzed frame by frame by martial arts enthusiasts and military professionals alike. However, not all reactions were positive. Some critics argued that the incident highlighted the militarization of British society and questioned whether armed guards were appropriate in a tourist setting. These voices were quickly drowned out by the overwhelming support for Fletcher and his colleagues. The personal impact of the incident on Fletcher was more complex than his public statements suggested. That evening, as he sat in his barracks room polishing his ceremonial rifle, he found himself thinking about the split-second decisions that had defined his day. In Afghanistan, violence had been expected, planned for, and anticipated. At Buckingham Palace, it had erupted from nowhere into what should have been a routine day of ceremonial duties. Fletcher's wife, Sarah, was a civilian doctor who had never fully understood the warrior mentality that drove her husband. When she saw the news footage that evening, she finally grasped the reality of what he carried within him. "I've been married to you for 5 years," she told him over the phone that night. "But today, I saw who you really are." The conversation was difficult but necessary. Fletcher had learned to compartmentalize his military experiences, keeping the violent necessities of combat separate from his civilian relationships. The palace incident had shattered that compartmentalization, forcing him to confront the reality that his training and experience were always with him, ready to emerge when circumstances demanded. His fellow guardsmen had mixed reactions to the incident. Some were proud of Fletcher's performance and the positive attention it brought to their regiment. Others worried about the increased scrutiny and pressure that would inevitably follow. The household division prided itself on tradition and ceremony. Suddenly, finding themselves thrust into the spotlight as combat soldiers was an uncomfortable adjustment. Sergeant Major David Walsh, Fletcher's immediate superior, had served in Northern Ireland during the Troubles and understood the psychological impact of sudden violence in apparently peaceful settings. He made sure Fletcher had access to the regiment's counseling services and encouraged him to talk through the incident with trained professionals. "The fact that you handled it perfectly doesn't mean it won't affect you," Walsh told Fletcher during their private conversation. "I've seen too many good soldiers think they had to be invulnerable to everything." The palace itself had to adapt to the new reality created by the incident. Tourist numbers actually increased in the days following the attack, with many visitors hoping to catch a glimpse of the hero guard. This created additional security challenges as crowds grew larger and more unpredictable. 3 weeks after the incident, on November 5th, Fletcher returned to ceremonial duties at Buckingham Palace. The crowds that morning were larger than usual, and he could feel the weight of their attention in a way he never had before. Children pointed at him and whispered to their parents. Cameras focused on him with renewed interest. A small girl named Emma Thompson, visiting London with her grandmother, approached Fletcher's position with a single red rose in her hand. She had seen the news coverage and, in her 8-year-old mind, understood that this soldier had protected people from bad men. She wanted to thank him in the only way she knew how. Emma's grandmother tried to pull her away, explaining that the guards couldn't move or speak while on duty, but the little girl was determined. She placed the rose at Fletcher's feet and stepped back, her eyes meeting his for just a moment. Fletcher couldn't break his ceremonial stance to acknowledge the gift, but those watching closely saw his eyes soften almost imperceptibly. In that moment, the full circle of his duty became clear from the battlefields of Afghanistan to the cobblestones of London. He stood as a guardian between innocence and chaos. The rose remained at his feet for the duration of his 2-hour watch, a small splash of color against his polished black boots. When the changing of the guard ceremony began, Fletcher marched away with his replacement unit, leaving the flower behind but carrying its message with him. Later that evening, Emma's grandmother found Fletcher's regimental headquarters and left a letter thanking him for his service. "My granddaughter has decided she wants to be a soldier when she grows up," the letter read. "She says she wants to protect people like you do." The incident at Buckingham Palace had lasted less than 30 seconds, but its ripple effects would continue for months and years to come. Fletcher's actions had demonstrated that the ceremonial guards were far more than tourist attractions. They were highly trained soldiers capable of lethal force when circumstances demanded it. The 4 attackers were eventually sentenced to prison, terms ranging from 18 months to 4 years. Mac Harrison, as the ringleader, received the harshest sentence, along with a lifetime ban from approaching any royal property. During his sentencing, Judge Patricia Williams noted that he was fortunate to have encountered a soldier with such restraint and professionalism. Fletcher was promoted to corporal within 6 months of the incident and eventually became an instructor at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, where he taught close-quarters combat to the next generation of British officers. He never spoke publicly about the incident, maintaining the quiet professionalism that had defined his actions. That October morning, the red rose that Emma had left at his feet was preserved and now sits in the Household Division's Regimental Museum, a small reminder that sometimes the greatest battles are won not through overwhelming force, but through precise action and unwavering discipline. The little girl who placed it there grew up to join the army herself, inspired by 30 seconds of perfect soldiering on a morning when chaos met order and found itself wanting.